Oak Haven, Midwest America. The ink is still wet on the contract. My hand trembles not from fear, but from the crushing weight of the power I now hold. My name is Charlotte Turner, and for a decade my father used every tool he had to erase me, my voice, my sacrifices, my very existence, just to keep my brother shining in the spotlight. He told the town I was dead to him. He didn't know that while he was screaming at an empty chair, I was quietly buying the walls around him. Tonight, I stop running. Tonight, I become the one holding the eraser. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The night my dad tried to erase me from our family, I was signing the contract that would erase his power instead. But to understand why I held that pen with a shaking hand, you have to understand where I came from and why running 500 miles away wasn't enough to save me. I grew up in Oak Haven, a dot on the map in the middle of the Rust Belt, where the only two things that mattered were God on Sunday mornings and the high school football score on Friday nights. It was the kind of place where people claimed to value community and hard work above all else, but there was a dark side to that closeness. Everyone knew everyone's business, and if you didn't fit the mold, the town didn't just ignore you. It actively tried to grind you down until you did. In the Turner household, the mold was cast in concrete and reinforced steel. My dad, Ron Turner, owned a small construction business. He was a man made of drywall dust, loud opinions, and calloused hands. To Ron, the world was simple. Men built things with their muscles, women kept the peace, and anyone who worked behind a desk was a soft-handed parasite leeching off real Americans. This philosophy made my existence a constant irritation to him. I was quiet, introverted, and obsessed with code. By the time I was 16, I could strip a computer down to its motherboard and rebuild it blindfolded. But in my house, that wasn't a skill, it was a defect. My mother, Elaine, was a ghost in her own home, a woman who had learned that the path of least resistance was to nod, smile, and let Ron steamroll over everything, including me. And then there was Tyler. My older brother was the golden child, the star quarterback who peaked junior year and spent the rest of his life chasing that high. He was charming, lazy, and utterly incapable of taking responsibility for anything. But to Dad, Tyler was the second coming. The pattern of my erasure started early, but the moment it truly crystallized was at my high school graduation party. It was a humid afternoon in our backyard, the air thick with the smell of charcoal and cheap light beer. I had just graduated as valedictorian, a feat that had cost me thousands of sleepless hours. Tyler, who had barely scraped by with C-minuses 2 years prior, was leaning against a cooler, laughing loudly. Dad clinked a fork against his beer bottle, calling for a toast. I stood up straight, smoothing my dress foolishly, thinking this was finally my moment. "I want to make a toast," Dad bellowed, his face flushed. "To the future of the Turner name. To Tyler for stepping up and taking a crew lead position next month. That's a real man's work, carrying the family legacy." The backyard erupted in applause. I stood there frozen. He hadn't mentioned me. When the clapping died down, a neighbor asked, "What about Charlotte? Heard she got some big scholarship." Dad waved his hand dismissively like he was swatting a fly. "Oh yeah, she's going off to study computers. Talks like a robot, that one. Hopefully she learns to focus on getting a husband instead of trying to outsmart everybody. Can't cuddle a keyboard at night, right?" The laughter that followed felt physical, like a slap. In that moment, surrounded by my own family, I realized I didn't exist to them as a person. I was just a background character in the Tyler Turner show. I swallowed the humiliation because I had a plan. I had been working nights at a greasy spoon diner, scrubbing tables and smelling like old fryer oil, saving every single dollar to get out. I sacrificed parties, dates, and sleep, but the sacrifice wasn't enough. 2 weeks before I was set to leave, Tyler wrecked his truck while driving home from a bar. He was unhurt, but the truck and the fence he plowed through were destroyed. I came home to find Dad in my room holding my lockbox. It was empty. "Tyler made a mistake," Dad said, not even looking at me. I need this to pay for the repairs and keep the cops out of it. We can't have him getting a record. That's my tuition money, I whispered, barely able to breathe. It's family money. Dad snapped his voice hard. Sometimes you gotta sacrifice for your brother. He's the future of this family. You'll be fine. He took it all, but he underestimated my desperation. I applied for emergency grants, took out predatory loans, and accepted a full-ride scholarship to a top university out of state that covered room and board. When I told Dad I was leaving anyway, the explosion was immediate. We stood in the kitchen, the air vibrating with his rage. You go off chasing that nonsense, don't expect help when it blows up, he spat, pointing a finger in my face. We raised you, but if you leave, you're on your own. You walk out that door, you're telling us you're better than us. I packed my bags that night. I looked at my mother, who turned her back to wash dishes that were already clean. I looked at Tyler, who wouldn't meet my eyes. I walked out the door, determined to prove my worth, even if it meant doing it as an orphan in all but name. I thought the distance would protect me. I thought 500 miles of highway was enough of a barrier against Ron Turner. I didn't know then that my dad would find a way to threaten my future, my reputation, and my sanity from 500 miles away. I thought I had escaped, but the ambush was just beginning. College was supposed to be freedom, but for the first 2 years it felt more like a frantic doggy paddle to keep my head above water. I wasn't just a student, I was a machine running on caffeine and desperation. While my classmates were rushing fraternities or spending their weekends at tailgates, I was juggling a full course load, 3 different part-time coding gigs, and a research assistantship that barely paid minimum wage. I lived in a state of perpetual exhaustion, but for the first time in my life, I was building something that was mine. I joined a small, underfunded research lab focused on developing AI tools for small businesses. That dusty basement lab became my sanctuary, the place where the seeds of my future began to sprout. I also found people who didn't look through me. There was Maya, my roommate, a chaotic, abstract artist who filled our dorm with paint fumes and forced me to take breaks for human maintenance, as she called it. There was Dr. Jonah Reed, a gruff professor who critiqued my code with brutal honesty, but told me without a hint of sarcasm that I had a mind capable of changing industries. And eventually, there was Evan Brooks. Evan was a marketing grad student with a laid-back smile that disarmed my defenses. He didn't care that I was awkward or that I prioritized Java over parties. He saw me. In Oakhaven, I was invisible. Here I was becoming solid. But the invisible tether to my father remained, choking me from hundreds of miles away. The phone calls were a ritualistic torture I felt obligated to endure. I'd see Dad's name on the screen and my stomach would drop. When I answered, there was never a "how are you" or "good job" on those grades. Instead, it was a barrage of minimization. All those computers, and you still can't pour concrete, huh? He'd say, his voice thick with condescension. Tyler's out here working in the real world, sweating for a paycheck while you play pretend with your little games. Mom was always there in the background, a silent accomplice. I would wait for her to defend me, to say, "She's working hard, Ron," but the line would just crackle with her silence. Then came the asks. They started small, a few $100 for a parts shortage or a cash flow hiccup. Then it was legal fees for Tyler's second DUI. "He's a good kid, Char, he just got unlucky," Dad would wheedle. "We're family. Family helps each other. Don't tell me you've forgotten that." And because I was conditioned to seek his approval, because I was desperate to buy my way back into his good graces, I sent the money. I was eating instant noodles, wearing shoes with holes in the soles, and skipping social outings to save pennies. Yet I wired thousands of dollars home to clean up Tyler's messes. I was bankrolling the very people who erased me from their conversations. Ironically, it was this pressure that birthed my company. I saw how badly my dad's business was struggling, the disorganized bids, the lost paperwork, the chaotic payroll. I teamed up with Evan and another engineer from my class to build a prototype. We called it Anchor Path. It was a platform designed to help small contractors automate their back-end operations, ensuring compliance and accurate bidding. It was the tool that could save my father's business. I was so naive. I thought if I brought him the solution, he would finally respect the engineer I had become. I flew home for the holidays during my junior year, armed with a laptop and a desperate hope. The house felt smaller, the air stale. At dinner, Dad dominated the conversation, boasting about a friend of Tyler's who had started a real startup, which turned out to be a predatory multi-level marketing scheme selling supplements. Dad talked about this guy like he was the next Steve Jobs. Now that's ambition, Dad said, slamming his hand on the table. Building a sales network, being a leader. I saw my opening. My heart hammering against my ribs, I opened my laptop. Actually, Dad, I wanted to show you what I've been working on. It's called Anchor Path. It's software specifically for construction firms like yours. It handles bids, payroll, OSHA compliance. I didn't even get to finish the sentence. Dad waved his hand, a look of pure disgust on his face. Put that toy away, Charlotte. We're trying to have a family dinner. But Dad, this could help you. It organizes— I said enough, he barked, silencing the room. Speak English. Nobody pays for that robot nonsense. You think a computer knows how to run a job site? Nobody wants a girl who thinks she's better than her family. You trying to erase where you came from with all this tech talk? Tyler snickered into his beer. She's the family robot, Dad. Beep boop. They laughed. My mother, my father, my brother. They laughed at my work, my passion, my offering. I sat there, the laptop screen glowing on my face, realizing the truth. It didn't matter what I built. To them, I was just a resource to be mined or a nuisance to be mocked. I closed the laptop slowly. The shame burned, but beneath it, something colder and harder was forming. If my parents wanted to erase me from the family story, fine. I was done trying to write myself into their margins. I would write my own story, one they couldn't control, and one they certainly couldn't erase. Back in the city, my life was finally beginning to resemble the American dream I'd been promised. Anchor Path wasn't just a slide deck on a laptop anymore. It was real. We had landed pilot customers in 3 nearby cities, and the efficiency numbers were staggering. Contractors using our platform were saving 20 hours a week on paperwork and cutting their compliance errors to near zero. Investors started circling men in expensive suits who used words like unicorn and disruptor. For the first time, I wasn't just the girl who studied too hard. I was a founder. I was building a future where my worth was measured by my code, not my ability to marry a linebacker. I was exhausted, sleeping 4 hours a night on a beanbag chair in our rented office space, but it was a good exhaustion. It was the fatigue of climbing a mountain I had chosen for myself. But while I was building, everything back in Oakhaven was crumbling. The updates I got from home were fragmented and terrifying. Ron's construction company was hemorrhaging money and clients. He was cutting corners to bid lower, ignoring safety regulations that he deemed government overreach. Tyler was technically managing the crews, but the rumors reaching me said he was managing them from the cab of his truck, usually nursing a hangover or a fresh buzz. It was a disaster waiting to happen, and inevitably it did. A scaffolding collapse at a residential site left a worker with a shattered leg and a permanent limp. An OSHA investigation was launched immediately. In a sane world, this would be the moment a father reflects on his choices. But Ron Turner didn't do reflection. He did deflection. To protect Tyler from negligence charges and himself from bankruptcy, Dad started a war. But he didn't fight the inspectors. He fought me. He needed a villain to explain why the family business was failing, someone to blame for the financial strain that forced them to cut corners. I became that villain. He started telling anyone who would listen at the hardware store, in the church pews, and on the local community Facebook pages that I had abandoned the family. He spun a narrative where I was the ungrateful daughter who had made it big and refused to help her struggling parents. He claimed I had drained their savings for my fancy school and left them to rot. The story spread like mold in a damp basement. In a small town, gossip is currency, and Ron was printing money. I didn't realize how bad it was until I had to go back for my great-aunt's funeral. I walked into the church expecting grief, but what I walked into was a wall of ice. People I had known my entire life, neighbors who had given me candy on Halloween, refused to meet my eyes. When I approached Mrs. Gable, my old piano teacher, she turned her back on me. I heard whispers in the vestibule. Ungrateful, heartless, thinks she's too good for us. I felt sick. I had spent years sending money home, sacrificing my own stability to keep their ship afloat, and this was my reward. I confronted Dad in the parking lot after the burial. He was leaning against his truck, looking red-faced and defiant. "You're lying about me to the whole town," I said, my voice shaking, not with fear, but with a rage I hadn't known I possessed. "I've sent you thousands of dollars. I'm the only reason you made payroll last month." He didn't flinch. "You did this when you left Charlotte. You sacrificed this family for your ego. I'm just telling the truth. You abandoned us." "I escaped you," I yelled. He took a step closer, invading my space, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "You listen to me. You keep running your mouth and I'll cut you out of everything. No inheritance, no piece of the business. To this family you'll be nothing. I will erase you, Charlotte. I will make sure not a single person in this town remembers your name with anything but spit in their mouth." The word erase hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't just a threat. It was a mission statement. I drove back to the city that night, tears blurring the highway lights, thinking the damage was contained to Oakhaven. I was wrong. 2 days later, we lost our lead investor. During their due diligence, they had scraped social media and found the threads in the Oakhaven community groups, dozens of comments from my neighbors, calling me a scam artist, a liar, and a family traitor. The investor called me, his voice cold. "We invest in people, Charlotte. And frankly, this level of personal volatility and character questioning is a risk we can't take." The call ended. The room went silent. I looked at the black screen of my phone. My father wasn't just hurting my feelings anymore. He was actively destroying my future. He was using the community I grew up in as a weapon to hunt me down. I sat there for a long time, the sadness evaporating, replaced by a cold, metallic clarity. If my dad wanted to make me the enemy of the town, then he had no idea what kind of enemy he'd just created. He thought he was fighting a helpless daughter. He didn't know he was picking a fight with a CEO who was done being erased. The investor who walked away was a painful loss, but in the world of startups, you don't mourn, you pivot. We doubled down on our metrics, proving that Anchor Path wasn't just a tool for contractors, but a necessity for municipal transparency. 3 months after my father tried to torch my reputation, we closed a Series A funding round with a top-tier venture capital firm in Chicago. We had millions in the bank and a mandate to modernize small-town America. Our target market was exactly the kind of place I had run from, municipalities stuck in the paper age, rife with inefficiency and good old boy handshake deals. It was almost fateful when the alert popped up on my dashboard. Oakhaven was launching a massive public infrastructure initiative, the Future Foundations Project. They were renovating the courthouse, repaving the main commercial district, and overhauling the permitting systems. It was a multi-million-dollar injection into the town's economy. And crucially, they were putting out a request for proposal for a digital backbone to manage the vendors. They needed a system to track bids, ensure compliance, and handle payments. They needed Anchor Path. I sat in my glass-walled office staring at the RFP document. The realization washed over me like cold water. If Anchor Path won the contract to manage the city's infrastructure platform, we would effectively control the gateway for every construction firm wanting a piece of the pie. We would set the standards. We would verify the safety records. We would be the filter. And I knew exactly which company wouldn't be able to pass through that filter. I brought the proposal to my board. The room was skeptical. "This is your hometown, Charlotte," my lead legal advisor warned, tapping his pen on the mahogany table. "We know the history. Using company resources to settle a personal score is a breach of fiduciary duty. It's messy. It's not personal." I lied, though my pulse was hammering in my throat. "It's the perfect test case. Oakhaven is the archetype of our target market. If we can clean up the corruption and inefficiency there, we can do it anywhere." We're not targeting anyone specific. We're just enforcing ethical standards, worker protections, transparency. If a company can't meet those standards, that's not our fault. That's the market correcting itself. They bought it because the numbers made sense. But I knew I was walking into a moral minefield. I didn't stop at the software bid. I knew my father. I knew Ron Turner leverage was always financial. He lived on credit, moving debt from one pile to another to keep the appearance of success. With the new capital and my own growing personal wealth, I set up a series of shell entities, vague, boring-sounding investment holdings that couldn't be traced back to me without a forensic accountant. Through these channels, I began quietly acquiring Turner Construction's distressed debt. I bought the lien on his heavy machinery. I bought the secondary mortgage on the warehouse. I bought the overdue notes from his suppliers. It wasn't sabotage. I wasn't forcing him into default. I was simply becoming the bank. I was holding the leash, and he didn't even feel the collar tightening. While I moved pieces on the chessboard, Dad was busy thumping his chest. Word reached me that he was already celebrating the Future Foundations project, as if the money were already in his account. He was boasting at the local bar that the city council practically ate out of his hand, and that this contract would finally set Tyler up as the titan of local industry. He was so confident that he called me. I stared at the phone for a long moment before answering. "Hello, Dad. I'm just calling to give you a warning," he barked, skipping the pleasantries. His voice was rough, likely from Celebration cigars. "I know you and your computer friends are sniffing around government contracts. I heard rumors. Anchor Path bids on municipal projects all over the Midwest, Dad. It's what we do." "Well, you don't do it in Oakhaven," he threatened. "This is my town. This is Tyler's time. The city council knows who built this place, and it wasn't some girl with a laptop. You better stay out of this contract, Charlotte. Don't you dare come back here with your computer junk and steal what belongs to this family. You interfere with Tyler's future, and I promise you, you won't just be erased. You'll be buried." He didn't know. He didn't know that the computer junk he despised was about to become the judge and jury of his business. He didn't know that the debt he thought he owed to faceless banks was actually owed to the daughter he had disowned. He was threatening a ghost, unaware that the ghost was already haunting his house. "I hear you, Dad," I said, my voice steady. "I won't do anything illegal. I'm just doing business." "You better hope so." He grunted and hung up. I set the phone down and looked out at the Chicago skyline. My father was playing a game of intimidation, relying on the old rules of bullying and bluster. He thought Turner Construction held all the cards because he knew the mayor and shouted the loudest. He had no idea I'd already bought the deck. The Oakhaven Community Center was a building that smelled permanently of stale coffee and floor wax, a place where bingo nights alternated with heated zoning disputes. But tonight the air was heavy with a different kind of electricity. It felt less like a town hall meeting and more like a gladiator arena. Every folding chair was taken. The room was packed with council members, local business owners, the press from the county paper, and half the congregation of First Baptist. My father had done his job well. He had rallied the troops. I sat in the very back row wearing a nondescript trench coat and keeping my head down. Nobody noticed me. All eyes were on the front of the room where Ron Turner stood at the podium, his chest puffed out like a rooster protecting his coop. Tyler sat behind him wearing a suit that didn't quite fit, looking uncomfortable but smug. They were the picture of the local dynasty my father pretended we were. The agenda item was the Future Foundations contract, the digital infrastructure bid that would control the flow of city money for the next decade. Dad wasn't there to bid on the software. He was there to ensure the software provider was someone he could manipulate. He was there to kill AnchorPath's bid before it even started framing it as an invasion of big city outsiders. Ron grabbed the microphone, the feedback whine slicing through the room. "Friends, neighbors," he boomed, using his best church deacon voice. "We stand at a crossroads. This town was built by families, by sweat, by trust. Now this city council wants to hand the keys over to some faceless tech company from Chicago. A company that doesn't know us, doesn't know our values. He gestured dramatically to Tyler. My son Tyler has been working these sites since he was a boy. He represents the future of Turner Construction, a company that has sacrificed everything for this town. We don't cut run, we stay. He paused for effect, his eyes scanning the crowd, looking for the nod of approval he felt entitled to. Then his voice dropped to a sorrowful performative register. I know what happens when you let outsiders in. I know the pain of betrayal. My own daughter. She ran off. Forgot her parents. Forgot the people who raised her. She abandoned us when we needed her most, chasing money and status. And now companies like this Anchor Path want to do the same thing to Oakhaven, come in, extract the value, and leave us to rot. We don't need outsiders coming in to erase the families who built this place. The room erupted in applause. I saw heads nodding. I heard murmurs of agreement. That's right, Ron. Keep it local. Shame about that girl. He had done it. He had publicly martyred himself and villainized me to secure a business deal. He was erasing me in real time, using my absence as a stepping stone for his son. The mayor tapped his gavel. Thank you, Mr. Turner. Powerful words. Now we will hear from the representative of the bidding firm Anchorpath Technologies. The room went quiet, expecting a slick lawyer in a $2,000 suit to walk in. I stood up. The folding chair scraped loudly against the linoleum. I took off my coat, revealing a sharp navy blazer, and walked down the center aisle. The sound of my heels clicking on the tile was the only noise in the room. As I passed the rows, I saw the confusion ripple through the crowd. Mrs. Gable squinted at me. The pastor's jaw went slack. I heard a whisper spread like a draft. Is that Ron's girl? I thought she moved away. What is she doing? I reached the front. My father looked up, and the color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. Tyler froze, his mouth hanging open. I didn't look at them. I stepped up to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at the sea of faces that had judged me for years. Good evening, I said, my voice steady, amplified through the speakers. My name is Charlotte Turner. I am the founder and CEO of Anchorpath Technologies. The gasp was audible. It sucked the oxygen right out of the room. My father gripped the edge of his table, his knuckles white. My father just told you a story. I continued, my eyes locking on the council members. He told you about loyalty. He told you about sacrifice, and he told you that I abandoned this family. I pressed a button on the remote in my hand. The projector screen behind me flared to life. But Anchorpath is built on transparency. We believe data tells the truth even when people don't. So before we talk about infrastructure, let's talk about the infrastructure of the Turner family. On the screen, a series of redacted bank statements appeared. They were blown up large enough for the back row to read. These are wire transfers, I narrated, pointing to the dates. August 2023. $4,000 to cover the payroll Turner Construction couldn't meet. November 2023. $12,000 for legal retainers for Tyler Turner. February 2024. $8,000 to catch up on the mortgage for the house my parents live in. I turned to face the crowd. My father told you I left to chase money. The truth is, I worked 3 jobs in college. I ate instant noodles and walked to work in the snow so I could send every spare dollar back here. I sacrificed my sleep, my comfort, and my own safety to support a family that was publicly pretending I didn't exist. I looked at my father. He was shaking, a vein bulging in his forehead. You didn't erase me because I left Dad. You tried to erase me because I was the one keeping the lights on, and you couldn't stand that your safety net was the daughter you despised. Lies! Ron screamed, jumping to his feet. It was a desperate animal sound. She's faking it. You think money makes you better than your own parents? You're no daughter of mine. He pointed a trembling finger at me. As far as this family is concerned, you're dead to us. I erase you. Right here, right now, I erase you. The room recoiled. My mother, sitting in the front row, burst into tears, burying her face in her hands. Tyler looked down at his shoes, unable to witness the destruction. But I didn't flinch. I let his words hang in the air, ugly and violent. "You can't erase me, Dad," I said quietly into the mic, "because I own the eraser." I clicked the remote again. A new document appeared on the screen. Legal filings, liens, debt notes. "Over the last 6 months, I have acquired the outstanding debt of Turner Construction," I announced. "The machinery, the warehouse, the credit lines. I own it. I am your primary creditor." The silence was absolute. It was the silence of a guillotine blade hovering at the top of its track. "Now here is the choice," I said, addressing the council and my father simultaneously. "Anchor Path is going to modernize this town. We are going to ensure every contractor pays their workers fairly, follows safety guidelines, and operates with transparency. If Turner Construction wants to bid on these city projects, they are welcome to. But they will do it through my system. They will be audited. They will be safe. And they will be honest." I looked my father in the eye. "You can step into a system where everyone is accountable, or you can walk away. But either way, you don't get to threaten me, you don't get to lie about me, and you certainly don't get to erase me anymore." I stepped back from the podium. The council members looked at each other stun-gunned. The mayor cleared his throat, looking from the raging red-faced man to the calm, composed woman who held the deed to his debts. "I move to accept the Anchor Path proposal," one councilwoman said, her voice cutting through the tension. "We need transparency, clearly." "Seconded," another member said immediately. All in favor, aye. It was unanimous. Ron Turner stood there, stripped of his narrative, stripped of his power, and stripped of his mask. He looked around the room, seeing pity in the eyes of his neighbors instead of admiration. He grabbed his coat, storming toward the side exit, spitting on the floor as he went. "You ruined this family, Charlotte," he hissed as he passed me. I watched him go, the door slamming shut behind him, leaving a vibration in the frame. I felt a weight lift off my chest, a burden I hadn't realized I'd been carrying since I was 16 years old. "No," I thought, the clarity ringing in my mind like a bell. "I just stopped letting you ruin me." The explosion I had detonated at the town hall didn't leave a crater of rubble. It left a mountain of paperwork. In the days following the vote, the reality of my hostile takeover set in. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restructuring. Turner Construction was subjected to a forensic audit that made the previous decade of my father's creative accounting look like child's play. We found safety violations that made my stomach turn, crews sent onto roofs without harnesses, electrical work done by unlicensed handymen, and overtime hours that had simply vanished from pay stubs. Under the terms of the debt restructuring, Ron remained the figurehead owner, but he had zero operational control. An interim manager from Anchor Path took over the logistics. And Tyler finally met the real world. He was stripped of his site supervisor title and given a choice: pick up a shovel and work as a general laborer for hourly wage or leave. For the first time in his life, I saw my brother in a hard hat, sweating through a shirt, actually earning the money he spent. He looked miserable, but he showed up. Dad, on the other hand, retreated. His pride had been shattered so publicly that he essentially went into hiding, sitting in his armchair with the blinds drawn, refusing to answer the phone. The town's reaction was a slow, grinding realignment. I didn't suddenly become the hero of Oakhaven. Small towns don't work like that. Change is too painful. There were plenty of people who still glared at me in the grocery store, whispering that I was a vindictive witch who had humiliated her own flesh and blood. To them, disrupting the patriarchal order was a greater sin than my father's theft. But there were people I didn't expect. A local electrician stopped me on the sidewalk to thank me. He'd been waiting on a $5,000 check from my dad for 6 months, and the new system had finally processed it. The Oakhaven Gazette, usually my father's personal newsletter, ran a front-page story. The headline wasn't "Local Girl Destroys Dad," but "Turner Construction Enters New Era of Compliance." It detailed the debts I had covered and the safety standards being implemented. For the first time, the town was reading a story where I wasn't the villain. But the real reckoning happened 3 nights later. I was staying at the small motel on the edge of town when there was a tentative knock at the door. I opened it to find my mother, Elaine. She looked smaller than I remembered, huddled inside a coat that seemed too big for her. She didn't have Dad with her. That alone was seismic. I let her in. She sat on the edge of the stiff motel bed, twisting her wedding ring, unable to look me in the eye. "He's not eating," she said softly. "He just sits there. He's grieving his ego, Mom. He'll eat when he gets hungry enough." I leaned against the dresser, crossing my arms. I felt a pang of guilt, sharp and familiar, but I didn't let it move me. "I didn't know," she whispered, tears leaking from her eyes. "I didn't know you were sending money. He told me business was picking up." "He told me you knew enough." I cut in, my voice gentle but firm. "You knew he ridiculed me. You knew he treated me like a servant to Tyler. You sat there at every dinner, every holiday, and you watched him chip away at me until there was almost nothing left." "I was scared, Charlotte," she sobbed. "You know how he is. I just wanted peace. I didn't want to rock the boat." "Mom, you didn't just refuse to rock the boat. You helped him throw me overboard." I sat down in the chair opposite her. "It wasn't just Dad. When you let him erase me from this family, you erased me too. Your silence was his permission." She looked up at me, her face ravaged by the realization of her own complicity. She apologized then, a messy, desperate apology for years of neglect. I listened, and I felt the grief of the childhood I never had wash over me. I wanted to hug her and tell her it was okay to slip back into the role of the dutiful daughter who fixes everything. But I couldn't. "I can forgive you eventually," I told her. "But things are different now. If you want to be in my life, you have to see me. You have to know who I am, not the version Ron tells you I am. I'm not his ATM, and I'm not his punching bag. I'm Charlotte." She nodded, wiping her face. We sat in silence for a long time. It was the first honest moment we'd shared in a decade. As she stood up to leave, she paused at the door, her hand on the knob. She looked back at me, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and confusion. "He keeps saying you sacrificed him to the town," she said, her voice trembling. "He says you sold him out." I looked at her, feeling a strange, calm strength in my chest. I finally understood the difference between betrayal and justice. "No, Mom," I said quietly. "I sacrificed my silence. He's just hearing the truth for the first time." 2 years later, the air in Oak Haven tasted different. It didn't smell like stagnation and diesel anymore. It smelled like sawdust and fresh paint. AnchorPath had become more than just a software platform. It was the nervous system of the town's revival. Our model here had become the gold standard, replicated in 36 municipalities across the Midwest. Workplace injuries were down 40%. Local small businesses were winning contracts that used to be reserved for the good old boys club. Workers were getting paid on time every time. I split my life now, spending 2 weeks in Chicago running the empire we'd built, and 2 weeks here in the town that had tried to spit me out. I parked my car in front of the newly renovated Oak Haven Community Center. It used to be a derelict warehouse on the edge of the industrial park, a place where teenagers went to break bottles and smoke. Now it was a hub of glass and steel. Inside, there were coding boot camps, trade skill workshops, and financial literacy classes for small business owners. I walked through the double doors, greeting the receptionist, a young woman who had once been fired from the diner for attitude but was now managing our logistics courses. Near the entrance, a simple bronze plaque was mounted on the brick. It read, "For the kids who were told they didn't belong. May no one erase you again." I spent the morning mentoring a group of high schoolers' kids who didn't fit the football star or cheerleader mold, kids who felt like aliens in their own living rooms. I saw myself in their guarded eyes. I was teaching them Python, but really, I was teaching them that they had value that couldn't be quantified by their father's expectations. That afternoon, I drove to the house I grew up in. The driveway was cracked, and the lawn was overgrown, a stark contrast to the manicured obsession it used to be. I found Ron sitting on the back porch. He looked smaller, as if the air had been let out of him. He wasn't the titan of industry anymore. He was just an old man living on a fixed income from a company he no longer controlled. Tyler was running a crew somewhere sober and exhausted, finally learning the trade he'd been credited with mastering years ago. Dad didn't stand up when I walked onto the porch. He just gestured to the empty plastic chair beside him. We sat in silence for a long time, watching a squirrel navigate the fence line. He didn't launch into a lecture. He didn't ask about my computer junk. "The business is doing good numbers," he said finally, his voice raspy. "That manager you hired, he knows his stuff." "He does," I replied neutrally. "Efficiency is up." Ron stared at his hands. They were trembling slightly. "I was terrified, you know," he murmured, avoiding my eyes. "When you left, I was terrified you'd succeed and everyone would see." He trailed off. "See what?" "See that I didn't know what the hell I was doing," he admitted. The confession hung heavy in the humid air. Tyler. Praising him, it was easy. He needed me. He was a mess, so he made me feel like the boss. But you didn't need me. You made me feel small, Charlotte. So I tried to make you smaller. He looked at me, then his eyes watery and red-rimmed. "I thought if I pushed you down I'd stay up. But if you were right all along, then I was wrong about everything. I couldn't live with that. So I tried to kill the part of the family that made me feel wrong." It was the most honest thing he had ever said. I felt a wave of pity, but it was distant, like looking at a shipwreck from the safety of the shore. I didn't reach out to hold his hand. I didn't offer him the absolution he was fishing for. "You didn't have to erase me to feel big, Dad," I said, my voice calm and final. "You chose to. You sacrificed your daughter to protect your ego." He nodded slowly, accepting the verdict. "I know, and I lost both." I stood up. "I'm not going to pretend the past didn't happen. You don't get access to my life, my company, or my peace. I won't carry your shame anymore, Dad. That's yours to keep." I walked to the edge of the porch steps. "Charlotte," he called out, his voice cracking. I'm glad you won." I looked back at him one last time. "You tried to erase me from this family," I said. "So I chose to build a bigger one outside these walls." I left him there on the porch, a king of nothing, and drove back to the community center. As I walked in, a dozen kids waved at me, and a local contractor stopped me to show me photos of his new work truck. I felt a profound sense of rooting not in the soil of my father's approval, but in the garden I had planted myself. This was my legacy. This was my proof of existence. My dad spent years trying to threaten silence and erase me. In the end, all he erased was his power over me. I'm still here. I'm still Charlotte Turner. And this time, I'm the one writing the story of my family. And so Charlotte closes the book on her past to open a new chapter defined entirely by her own strength. If this story of resilience and justice resonated with you, please consider hitting the subscribe button to support the channel. Let us know your take on her final decision in the comments below. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Ashes of Yesterday. We'll see you next time.